Relax and listen to the voice. The wishing table, the golden ass, and the cudgel in the sack. There was once upon a time a tailor who had 3 sons and only 1 goat. But as the goat supported all of them with her milk, she was obliged to have good food and to be taken every day to pasture. The sons did this in turn. Once the eldest took her to the churchyard where the finest herbs were to be found, and let her eat and run about there. At night, when it was time to go home, he asked, "Goat, have you had enough?" The goat answered,
"I've eaten so much, not a leaf more I'll touch. Meh, meh."
"Come home then," said the youth, and took hold of the cord around her neck, led her into the stable, and tied her up securely. "Well," said the old tailor, "has the goat had as much food as she ought?" "Oh," answered the son, "she has eaten so much, not a leaf more she'll touch." But the father wished to satisfy himself, and went down to the stable, stroked the dear animal, and asked, "Goat, are you satisfied?" The goat answered,
"How should I be satisfied? Among the ditches I leapt about, found no leaf, so I went without. Meh, meh."
"What do I hear?" cried the tailor, and ran upstairs and said to the youth, "Hi, you liar! You said that the goat had had enough, and have let her hunger." And in his anger he took the yard measure from the wall, and drove him out with blows. The next day it was the turn of the second son, who sought a place in the fence of the garden, where nothing but good herbs grew, and the goat gobbled them all up. At night, when he wanted to go home, he asked the goat, "Are you satisfied?" The goat answered,
"I have eaten so much, not a leaf more I'll touch. Meh, meh."
"Come home then," said the youth, and led her home, and tied her up in the stable. "Well," said the old tailor, "has the goat had as much food as she ought?" "Oh," answered the son, "she's eaten so much, not a leaf more she will touch." The tailor would not rely on this, but went down to the stable and said, "Goat, have you had enough?" The goat answered,
"How should I be satisfied? Among the ditches I leapt about, found no leaf, so I went without. Meh, meh."
"The godless wretch," cried the tailor, "to let such a good animal hunger," and he ran up and drove the youth out of the doors with the yard measure. Now came the turn of the third son, who wanted to do his duty well, and sought out some bushes with the finest leaves, and let the goat devour them. In the evening, when he wanted to go home, he asked the goat, "Have you had enough?" The goat answered,
"I have eaten so much, not a leaf more I shall touch. Meh, meh."
"Come home then," said the youth, and led her into the stable, and tied her up. "Well," said the old tailor, "has the goat got her full share of food?" "She has eaten so much, not a leaf more she'll touch." The tailor was distrustful, went down and asked, "Goat, have you had enough?" The wicked beast answered,
"How should I be satisfied? Among the ditches I leapt about, found no leaf, so went without. Meh, meh."
"Oh, the brood of liars!" cried the tailor, "each as wicked and forgetful of his duty as the other. You shall no longer make a fool of me." And quite beside himself with anger, he ran upstairs and belabored the poor young fellow so vigorously with the yard measure that he sprang out of the house. The old tailor was now alone with his goat. Next morning he went down into the stable, stroked the goat, and said, "Come, my dear little animal, I myself will take you to the feed." He took her by the rope and conducted her to a green hedges, and amongst milfoil and whatever else goats like to eat. "There you may for once eat to your heart's content," said he to her, and let her browse until evening. Then he asked, "Goat, are you satisfied?" She replied,
"I have eaten so much, not a leaf more I will touch. Meh, meh."
"Come home then," said the tailor, and led her into the stables and tied her fast. When he was going away, he turned around again and said, "Well, are you satisfied for once?" But the goat behaved no better to him, and cried,
"How should I be satisfied? Among the ditches I leapt about, I found no leaf, so I went without. Meh, meh."
When the tailor heard that, he was shocked, and saw clearly that he had driven away his 3 sons without cause. "Wait, you ungrateful creature," cried he. "It is not enough to drive you forth. I will brand you so that you will no more dare to show yourself among honest tailors." In the great haste he ran upstairs, fetched his razor, lathered the goat's head, and shaved her as clean as the palm of his hand. And as the yard measure would have been too good for her, he brought the horsewhip, and gave her such cuts with it that she bounded away with tremendous leaps. When the tailor was thus left quite alone in his house, he fell into great grief, and would gladly have his sons back again, but no one knew where they had gone. The eldest had apprenticed himself to a joiner, and learnt industriously and indefatigably, and when the time came for him to go traveling, his master presented him with a little table which was not particularly beautiful, and was made of a common wood, but which had one good property. If anyone set it out and said, "Little table, spread yourself," the good little table was at once covered with a clean little cloth, and a plate was there, and a knife and a fork beside it, and dishes with boiled meats and roasted meats, as many as there was room for, and a great glass of red wine shone so that it made a heart glad. The young journeyman thought, "With this you have enough for your whole life," and went joyously about the world, and never troubled himself at all whether an inn was good or bad, or if anything else was to be found in it or not. When it suited him, he did not enter an inn at all, but either on the plain, in a wood, a meadow, or wherever he fancied. He took his little table off his back, set it down before him, and said, "Spread yourself," and then everything appeared that his heart desired. At length he took it into his head to go back to his father, whose anger would now be appeased, and who would now willingly receive him with his magic table. It came to pass that on his way home he came one evening to an inn which was filled with guests. They bade him welcome, and invited him to sit and eat with them, for otherwise he would have difficulty in getting anything. "No," answered the joiner, "I will not take the few morsels out of your mouths. Rather than that, you shall be my guests." They laughed and thought he was jesting with them. He placed his wooden table in the middle of the room and said, "Little table, spread yourself." Instantly it was covered with food, so good that the host could never have procured it, and the smell of it ascended pleasantly to the nostrils of the guests. "Fall to, dear friends," said the joiner, and the guests, when they saw that he meant it, did not need to be asked twice, but drew near, pulled out their knives, and attacked it valiantly. And what surprised them the most was that when a dish became empty, a full one instantly took its place of its own accord. The innkeeper stood in one corner and watched the affair. He did not at all know what to say, but thought, "You could easily find a use for such a cook as that in your household." The joiner and his comrades made merry until late into the night. At length they lay down to sleep, and the young apprentice also went to bed, and he set his magic table against the wall. The host's thoughts, however, let him have no rest. It occurred to him that there was a little old table in his lumber room, which looked just like the apprentice's, and he brought it out, and carefully exchanged it for the wishing table. Next morning the joiner paid for his bed, took up his table, never thinking that he had gotten a false one, and he went on his way. At midday he reached his father, who received him with great joy. "Well, my dear son, what have you learnt?" said he to him. "Father, I have become a joiner." "A good trade," replied the old man, "but what have you brought back with you from your apprenticeship?" "Father, the best thing which I have brought back with me is this little table." The tailor inspected it on all sides and said, "You did not make a masterpiece when you made that. It's a bad old table." "But it is a table which furnishes itself," replied the son. "When I set it out and tell it to spread itself, the most beautiful dishes stand on it, and wine also, which gladdens the heart. Just invite our relations and friends. They shall refresh and enjoy themselves for once, for the table will give them all they require." When the company was assembled, he put his table in the middle of the room and said, "Little table, spread yourself." But the little table did not bestir itself, and remained just as bare as any other table which did not understand language. Then the poor apprentice became aware that his table had been changed, and was ashamed at having to stand there like a liar. The relations, however, mocked him, and were forced to go home without having eaten or drunk. The father brought out his patches again, and went on tailoring, but the son went to a master in the craft. The second son had gone on to a miller, and had apprenticed himself to him. When his years were over, the master said, as you have conducted yourself so well, I give you an ass of a peculiar kind, which neither draws a cart nor carries a sack." "Well, what good is he then?" asked the young apprentice. "He spews forth gold," answered the miller. "If you set him on a cloth and say 'Bricklebrit,' the good animal will spew forth gold pieces for you from back and front." "That is a fine thing," said the apprentice, and thanked the master, and went out into the world. When he had need of gold, he had only to say "Bricklebrit" to his ass, and it rained gold pieces, and he had nothing to do but pick them off the ground. Wheresoever he went, the best of everything was good enough for him, and the dearer the better, for he always had a full purse. When he had looked about the world for some time, he thought, "You must seek out your father. If you go to him with the gold ass, he will forget his anger, and receive you well." It came to pass that he came to the same inn in which his brother's table had been exchanged. He led his ass in by the bridle, and the host was about to take the animal from him and tie him up, but the young apprentice said, "Don't trouble yourself. I will take my gray horse into the stable, and tie him up myself too, for I must know where he stands." This struck the host as odd, and he thought that a man who was forced to look after his ass himself could not have very much money to spend. But when the stranger put his hand in his pocket and brought out 2 gold pieces, and said he was to provide something good for him, the host opened his eyes wide, and ran and sought out the best he could muster. After dinner, the guest asked what he owed. The host did not see why he should not double the reckoning, and said the apprentice must give 2 more gold pieces. He felt in his pocket, but his gold was just at an end. "Wait an instant, sir host," said he. "I will go and fetch some money." But he took his tablecloth with him. The host could not imagine what this could mean, and being curious, he stole after him, and as the guest bolted the stable door, he peeped through a hole left by a knot in the wood. The stranger spread out the cloth under the animal and cried, "Bricklebrit!" and immediately the beast began to let gold pieces fall from back and front, so that it fairly rained down money on the ground. "Oh my word," said the host, "ducats are quickly coined there. A purse like that is not to be sniffed at." The guest paid his score and went to bed, but in the night the host stole down into the stable, led away the master of the mint, and tied up another ass in his place. Early next morning the apprentice traveled away with his ass, and thought that he had his gold ass. At midday he reached his father, who rejoiced to see him again, and gladly took him in. "What have you made of yourself, my son?" asked the old man. "A miller, dear father," he answered. "What have you brought back with you from your travels?" "Nothing else but an ass." "There are asses enough here," said the father. "I would rather have had a good goat." "Yes," replied the son, "but it is no common ass, but a gold ass. When I say Bricklebrit, the good beast spews forth a whole sheet full of gold pieces. Just summon all of our relations hither, and I will make them rich folks." "That suits me well," said the tailor, "for then I shall have no need to torment myself any longer with the needle," and ran out himself and called the relations together. As soon as they were assembled, the miller bade them make way, spread out his cloth, and brought the ass into the room. "Now watch," said he, and cried, "Bricklebrit!" But what fell were not gold pieces, and it was clear that the animal knew nothing of the art, for every ass does not attain such perfection. Then the poor miller pulled a long face, saw that he was betrayed, and begged pardon of the relatives, who went home as poor as they came. There was no help for it. The old man had to betake him to his needle once more, and the youth hired himself to a miller. The third brother had apprenticed himself to a turner, and as that is a skilled labor, he was the longest in learning. His brothers, however, told him in a letter how badly things had gone with them, and how the innkeeper had cheated them of their beautiful wishing gifts on the last evening before they reached home. When the turner had served his time, and had set out to his travels, as he had conducted himself so well, his master presented him with a sack and said, "There is a cudgel in it." "I can put on the sack," said he, "and it may be of good service to me, but why should the cudgel be in it? It only makes it heavy." "I will tell you why," replied the master. "If anyone has done anything to injure you, but do say, 'Out of the sack, Cudgel,' and the cudgel will leap forth among the people, and play such a dance on their backs that they will not be able to stir or move for a week, and it will not leave off until you say, 'Into the sack, Cudgel.'" The apprentice thanked him and put the sack on his back, and when anyone came too near him and wished to attack him, he said, "Out of the sack, Cudgel," and instantly the cudgel sprang out and dusted the coat or jacket of one after the other on their backs, and never stopped until it had stripped it of them. And it was done so quickly that before anyone was aware, it was already his own turn. In the evening, the young turner reached the inn where his brothers were cheated. He laid his sack on the table before him and began to talk of all the wonderful things which he had seen in the world. "Yes," said he, "people may easily find a table which will spread itself, a gold ass, and things of that kind, extremely good things which I by no means despise. But these are nothing in comparison with the treasure which I have won for myself, and am carrying about with me in this sack here." The innkeeper pricked up his ears. "What in the world could that be?" thought he. "The sack must be filled with nothing but jewels. I ought to get them cheap too, for all good things go in threes." When it was time for sleep, the guest stretched himself on the bench and laid his sack beneath him for a pillow. When the innkeeper thought his guest was lying in a sound sleep, he went to him and pushed and pulled quite gently and carefully at the sack to see if he could possibly draw it away and lay another in its place. The turner, however, had been waiting for this for a long time, and now, just as the innkeeper was about to give a hearty tug, he cried, "Out of the sack, Cudgel!" Instantly the little cudgel came forth and fell on the innkeeper and gave him a sound thrashing. The host cried for mercy, but the louder he cried, the harder the cudgel beat the time on his back, until at length he fell to the ground, exhausted. Then the turner said, "If you do not give back the table which spreads itself, and the gold ass, the dance shall begin afresh." "Oh no," cried the host, quite humbly, "I will gladly produce everything, only make the accursed kobold creep back into the sack." Then said the apprentice, "I will let mercy take the place of justice, but beware of getting into mischief again." So he cried, "Into the sack, Cudgel," and let the man have rest. Next morning the turner went home to his father with the wishing table and the gold ass. The tailor rejoiced when he saw him once more, and asked him likewise what he had learned in foreign parts. "Dear father," said he, "I have become a turner." "A skilled trade," said the father. "What have you brought back with you from your travels?" "A precious thing, dear father," replied the son, "a cudgel in the sack." "What?" cried the father, "a cudgel? That's certainly worth your trouble. From every tree you can cut yourself one. But not one like this, dear father. If I say, 'Out of the sack, Cudgel,' the cudgel springs out and leads anyone ill-disposed towards me a weary dance, and never stops until he lies on the ground and prays for fair weather. With this cudgel have I rescued the wishing table and the gold ass which the thievish innkeeper took away from my brothers. Now let them both be sent for, and invite all of our kinsmen. I will give them to eat and to drink, and will fill their pockets with gold into the bargain." The old tailor had not much confidence. Nevertheless, he summoned the relatives together. Then the turner spread a cloth in the room and had let in the gold ass, and said to his brother, "Now, dear brother, speak to him." The miller said, "Bricklebrit," and instantly the gold pieces rained down on the cloth like a thunder shower, and the ass did not stop until every one of them had so much that they could carry no more. I can see by your face, dear listener, that you also would have liked to have been there. Then the turner brought a little table and said, "Now, dear brother, speak to it." And scarcely had the carpenter said, "Table, spread yourself," than it was spread and amply covered with the most exquisite dishes. Then such a meal took place as the good tailor had never yet known in his house, and the whole party of kinsmen stayed together till far into the night, and were all merry and glad. The tailor locked away needle and thread, yard measure and goose, in a closet, and lived with his 3 sons in joy and splendor. What, however, happened to the goat who was to blame for the tailor driving out his 3 sons? That I will tell you. She was ashamed that she had a bald head, and ran to a fox's hole and crept into it. When the fox came home, he was met by 2 great eyes shining out of the darkness, and was terrified and ran away. A bear met him, and as the fox looked quite disturbed, he said, "What is the matter with you, brother fox? Why do you look like that?" "Oh," answered Redskin, "a fierce beast is in my cave, and stared at me with his fiery eyes." "We will soon drive him out," said the bear, and went with him to the cave and looked in. But when he saw the fiery eyes, fear seized on him likewise. He would have nothing to do with the furious beast, and took to his heels. The bee met him, and as she saw that he was still ill at ease, she said, "Bear, you are really pulling a very pitiful face. what has become of all your gaiety?" "It is all very well for you to talk," replied the bear. "A furious beast with staring eyes is in Redskin's house, and we can't drive him out." The beast said, "Bear, I pity you. I am a poor weak creature whom you could not turn aside to look at, but still I believe I can help you." She flew into the fox's cave, lighted on the goat's smoothly shorn head, and stung her so violently that she sprang up, crying, "Meh, meh," and ran forth into the world as if mad, and to this hour no one knows where she has gone. The Elves. 3 Separate Tales. Story 1. A shoemaker, by no fault of his own, had become so poor that at last he had nothing left but leather for one pair of shoes. So in the evening he cut out the shoes which he wished to begin to make the next morning, and as he had a good conscience, he lay down quietly in his bed, commended himself to God, and fell asleep. In the morning, after he had said his prayers and was just going to sit down to work, the 2 shoes stood quite finished on his table. He was astounded, and knew not what to think. He took the shoes in his hands to observe them closer, and they were so neatly made, with not one bad stitch in them, that it was just as if they were intended as a masterpiece. Before long, a buyer came in, and as the shoes pleased him so well, he paid more for them than was customary, and, with that money, the shoemaker was able to purchase leather for 2 pairs of shoes. He cut them out at night, and the next morning was about to set to work with fresh courage, but he had no need to do so, for, when he got up, they were already made, and buyers also were not wanting, who gave him money enough to buy leather for 4 more pairs of shoes. Again, the following morning he found the pairs made, and so it went constantly. What he had cut out in the evening was finished by the morning, so that he soon had his honest independence again, and at last became a wealthy man. Now, it befell that one evening, not long before Christmas, when the man had been cutting out, he said to his wife, "Before going to bed, what think you if we were to stay up tonight to see who it is that lends us this helping hand?" The woman liked the idea, and lighted a candle, and then they hid themselves in a corner of the room, behind some clothes which were hanging up there, and watched. When it was midnight, 2 pretty little naked men came, sat down by the shoemaker's table, took all the work which was cut out before them, and began to stitch and sew and hammer so skillfully and so quickly with their little fingers that the shoemaker could not avert his eyes for astonishment. They did not stop until all was done and stood finished on the table, and then they ran quickly away. The next morning the woman said, "The little men have made us rich, and we really must show that we are grateful for it. They run about so, and have nothing on, and must be cold. I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make them little shirts and coats, and vests and trousers, and knit both of them a pair of stockings, and you make them 2 little pairs of shoes." The man said, "I shall be very glad to do it." And one night, when everything was ready, they laid their presents all together on the table instead of the cut-out work, and then concealed themselves to see how the little men would behave. At midnight they came bounding in, and wanted to get to work at once, but as they did not find any leather cut out, but only the pretty little articles of clothing, they were at first astonished, and then they showed intense delight. They dressed themselves with the greatest rapidity, put on the beautiful clothes, and sang, "Now we are the boys so fine to see, why should we longer cobblers be?" Then they danced and skipped, and leapt over chairs and benches. At last they danced out of the doors. From that time forth they came no more, but as long as the shoemaker lived, all went well with him, and all of his efforts prospered. Story 2. There was once a poor servant girl who was industrious and cleanly, and swept the house every day, and emptied her sweepings on the great heap in front of the door. One morning, when she was just going back to her work, she found a letter on this heap, and as she could not read, she put her broom in the corner, and took the letter to her employers, and behold, it was an invitation from the Elves, who asked the girl to hold a child for them at its christening. The girl did not know what to do, but, at length, after much persuasion, and as they told her that it was not right to refuse an invitation of this kind, she consented. Then 3 elves came and conducted her to a hollow mountain where the little folks lived. Everything there was small, but more elegant and beautiful than can be described. The baby's mother lay in a bed of black ebony ornamented with pearls. The covers were embroidered with gold, the cradle was of ivory. The bathtub was also of gold. The girl stood as godmother, and then wanted to go home again, but the little elves urgently entreated her to stay 3 days with them. So she stayed, and passed the time in pleasure and gaiety, and the little folks did all they could to make her happy. At last she set out on her way home, but first they filled her pockets quite full of money, and then they led her out of the mountains again. When she got home, she wanted to begin her work, and took the broom, which was still standing in the corner, in her hand, and began to sweep. Then some strangers came out of the house, who asked her who she was, and what business she had there. And she had not, as she thought, been 3 days with the little men in the mountains, but 7 years, and in the meantime her former masters had died. Story 3. A certain mother had her child taken out of its cradle by the elves, and a changeling with a large head and staring eyes, which would do nothing but eat and drink, lay in its place. In her trouble, she went to her neighbor and asked her advice. The neighbor said that she was to carry the changeling into the kitchen, set it down at the hearth, light a fire, and boil some water and 2 eggshells, which would make the changeling laugh, and if he laughed, all would be over with him. The woman did everything that her neighbor bade her to do. When she put the eggshells with the water on the fire, Goggle Eyes said, "I am as old now as the Western forest, but never yet have I seen anyone boil anything in an eggshell," and it began to laugh about it. Whilst it was laughing, suddenly came a host of little elves, who brought the right child, set it down on the hearth, and took the changeling baby away with them. The Robber Bridegroom. There was once upon a time a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and as she was grown up, he wished that she was provided for and well married. He thought, "If any good suitor comes and asks for her, I will give her to him." Not long afterwards, a suitor came who appeared to be very rich, and as the miller had no fault to find with him, he promised his daughter to him. The maiden, however, did not like him quite so much as the girl should like a man with whom she is engaged, and had no confidence in him. Whenever she saw or thought of him, she felt a secret horror. Once he said to her, "You are my betrothed, and yet you have never once paid me a visit." The maiden replied, "I know not where your house is." Then said the bridegroom, "My house is out there in the dark forest." She tried to excuse herself, and said she could not find the way there. The bridegroom said, "Next Sunday you must come up there to me. I have already invited the guests, and I will strew ashes in order that you may find your way through the forest." When Sunday came, and the maiden had to set out on her way, she became very uneasy. She herself knew not exactly why, and to mark her way she filled both of her pockets full of peas and lentils. Ashes were strewn at the entrance of the forest, and these she followed, but at every step she threw a couple of peas on the ground. She walked almost the whole day until she reached the middle of the forest, where it was the darkest, and there stood a solitary house, which she did not like, for it looked so dark and dismal. She went inside of it, but no one was within, and the most absolute stillness reigned. Suddenly a voice cried, turn back, young maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here." The maiden looked up and saw that the voice came from a bird, which was hanging in a cage on a wall. Again it cried, turn back, young maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here." Then the young maiden went on farther from one room to another, and walked through the whole house, but it was entirely empty, and not one human being was to be found. At last she came to the cellar, and there sat an extremely aged woman, whose head shook constantly. "Can you not tell me," said the maiden, "if my betrothed lives here?" "Alas, poor child," replied the old woman, "whither you have come? You are in a murderer's den. You think you are a bride soon to be married, but you will keep your wedding with death. Look,
I have been forced to put a great kettle on there with water in it, and when they have you in their power, they will cut you to pieces without mercy, will cook you and eat you, for they are eaters of human flesh. If I do not have compassion with you and save you, you are lost."
Thereupon the old woman led her behind a great hogshead where she could not be seen.
"Be still as a mouse," said she. "Do not make a sound or move, or all will be over with you. At night, when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have long waited for an opportunity."
Hardly was this done than the godless crew came home. They dragged with them another young girl. They were drunk and paid no heed to her screams and lamentations. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, 1 glass of white wine, 1 glass of red, and a glass of yellow, and with this her heart burst in twain. Thereupon they tore off her delicate raiment, laid her on a table, cut her beautiful body in pieces, and strewn salt thereon. The poor bride behind the cask trembled and shook, for she saw right well what fate the robbers had destined for her. One of them noticed the gold ring on the finger of the murdered girl, and as it would not come off, he took an axe and cut the finger off, but it sprang up in the air, away, over the cask, and fell straight into the bride's bosom. The robber took a candle and wanted to look for it, but could not find it. Then another of them said, "Have you looked behind the great hogshead?" But the old woman cried, "Come and get something to eat, and leave off looking till the morning. The finger won't run away from you." Then the robbers said, "The old woman is right," and gave up their search, and sat down to eat. And the old woman poured a sleeping draught in their wine, so that they soon lay down in the cellar, and slept and snored. When the bride heard that, she came out from behind the hogshead, and had to step over the sleepers, for they lay in rows on the ground, and great was her terror lest she should awaken one of them. But God helped her, and she got safely over. The old woman went up with her, opened the doors, and they hurried out of the murderer's den with all the speed in their power. The wind had blown away the strewn ashes, but the peas and lentils had sprouted and grown up, and showed them the way in the moonlight. They walked the whole night, until in the morning they arrived at the mill, and then the maiden told her father everything exactly as it had happened. When the day came for the wedding to be celebrated, the bridegroom appeared, and the miller had invited all his relations and friends. As they sat at the table, each was bidden to relate something. The bride sat still and said nothing. Then said the bridegroom to the bride, "Come, my darling, do you know nothing? Relate something to us like the rest." She replied, "Then I will relate a dream. I was walking alone through a wood, and at last I came to a house, in which no living soul was, but on the wall there was a bird in a cage which cried, 'Turn back, young maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here.' And this it cried once more, 'My darling, I only dreamt this.' Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and there was something so horrible about them. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat a very, very old woman, whose head shook. I asked her, 'Does my bridegroom live in this house?' She answered, 'Alas, poor child, you have gotten into a murderer's den. Your bridegroom does live here, but he will hew you in pieces and kill you, and then he will cook you and eat you.' My darling, I only dreamt this. But the old woman hid me behind a great hogshead, and scarcely was I hidden when the robbers came home, dragging a maiden with them, to whom they gave 3 kinds of wine to drink, white, red, and yellow, with which her heart broke in twain. My darling, I only dreamt this. Thereupon they pulled off her pretty clothes, and hewed her fair body in pieces on a table, and sprinkled them with salt. My darling, I only dreamt this. And one of the robbers saw that there was still a ring on her little finger, and as it was hard to draw off, he took an axe and cut it off, but the finger sprang up in the air, and sprang behind the great hogshead, and fell into my bosom, and there is the finger with the ring." And with these words she drew it forth, and showed it to those who were present. The robber, who had during this story become as pale as ashes, leapt up and wanted to escape, but the guests held him fast, and delivered him over to justice. Then he and his whole troop were executed for their infamous deeds. The Godfather. A poor man had so many children that he had already asked everyone in the world to be godfather, and when still another child was born, no one else was left whom he could invite. He knew not what to do, and in his perplexity he lay down and fell asleep. Then he dreamt that he was to go outside the gate and ask the first person he met to be godfather. When he awoke, he determined to obey his dream, and went outside the gate and asked the first person who came up to him to be the godfather. The stranger presented him with a little glass of water and said, "This is wonderful water. With it you can heal the sick. Only you must see where death is standing, and if he is standing by the patient's head, give the patient some of the water, and he will be healed. But if death is standing by his feet, all trouble will be in vain, for the sick man must die." From this time forth, the man could always say whether a patient could be saved or not, and became famous for his skill, and earned a great deal of money. Once he was called into the child of a king, and when he entered, he saw death standing by the child's head, and cured it with the water, and he did the same a second time. But the third time, death was standing by its feet, and then he knew the child had to die. Once, the man thought he would visit the godfather, and tell him how he had succeeded with the water, but when he entered the house, the strangest things were going on within. On the first flight of stairs, the broom and shovel were disputing, and knocking each other about violently. He asked them, "Where does the godfather live?" The broom replied, "1 flight of stairs higher up." When he came to the second flight, he saw a heap of dead fingers lying. He asked, "Where does the godfather live?" One of the fingers replied, "1 flight of stairs higher." On the third flight lay a heap of dead hands, which again directed him to the flight beyond. On the fourth flight, he saw fishes on the fire, which frizzled in pans and baked themselves. They, too, said 1 flight of stairs higher, and when he had ascended the fifth, he came to a door of a room and peeped through the keyhole, and there he saw the godfather, who had a pair of long horns. When he opened the door and went in, the godfather got into bed in a great hurry and covered himself up. Then said the man, "Sir Godfather, what a strange household you have. When I came to your first flight of stairs, the shovel and broom were quarreling and beating each other violently." "How stupid you are," said the godfather. "That was the boy and the maid talking to each other." "But on the second flight, I saw some dead fingers lying." "Oh, how silly you are. Those were some roots of scorzonera." "On the third flight lay a heap of dead man's hands." "Foolish man, those were cabbages." "Well, on the fourth flight I saw fishes in a pan, which were hissing and baking themselves." When he had said that, the fishes came and served themselves up. "And when I got to the fifth flight, I peeped through the keyhole of a door, and there, godfather, I saw you, and you had long, long horns." "Oh, that is not true." The man became alarmed and ran out, and if he had not, who knows what the godfather would have done to him. Frau Trude. There was once a little girl who was obstinate and inquisitive, and when her parents told her to do anything, she did not obey them, so how could she fare well? One day she said to her parents, "I have heard so much of Frau Trude, I will go to her some day. People say that everything about her does look so strange, and that there are such odd things in her house, that I have become quite curious." Her parents absolutely forbade her and said, "Frau Trude is a bad woman who does wicked things, and if you go to her, you are no longer our child." But the maiden did not let herself be turned aside by her parents' prohibition, and still went to Frau Trude. And when she got to her, Frau Trude said, "Why are you so pale?" "Oh," she replied, and her whole body trembled, "I have been so terrified at what I have seen." "What have you seen?" "I saw a black man on your steps." "That was a collier." "Then I saw a green man." "That was a huntsman." "After that, I saw a blood-red man." "Oh, that was a butcher." "Oh, Frau Trude, I was terrified. I looked through the window and saw not you, but as I verily believe, the devil himself, with a head of fire." "Oh-ho," said she. "Then you have seen the witch in her proper costume. I have been waiting for you, and wanting a long time already. You shall give me some light." Then she changed the girl into a block of wood and threw it into the fire. And when it was all in a full blaze, she sat down close to it and warmed herself by it and said, "That shines bright for once in a way." Thumbling as Journeyman. A certain tailor had a son who happened to be small and no bigger than a thumb, and on this account he was always called Thumbling. He had, however, some courage in him, and said to his father, "Father, I must and will go out into the world." "That's right, my son," said the old man, and took a long darning needle and made a knob of sealing wax on it at the handle. "And there is a sword for you to take with you on the way." Then the little tailor wanted to have one more meal with them, and hopped into the kitchen to see what his mother had cooked for the last time. But it was already served, and the dish stood on the hearth. Then he said, "Mother, what is there to eat today?" "See for yourself," said his mother. So Thumbling jumped on the hearth and peeped into the dish, but as he stretched his neck in too far, the steam from the food caught hold of him and carried him up the chimney. He rode about in the air on the steam for a while, until at length he sank down to the ground again. Now, the little tailor was outside in the wide world, and he traveled about, and went to a master in his craft, but the food was not good enough for him. "Mistress, if you give us no better food," said Thumbling, "I will go away, and early tomorrow morning I will write with chalk on the door of your house, 'Too many potatoes, too little meat.'" "Farewell, Mr. Potato King. What would you have forsooth, grasshopper?" said the mistress, and grew angry and seized the dishcloth, and was just going to strike him, but my little tailor crept nimbly under a thimble, peeped out from beneath it, and put his tongue out at the mistress. She took up the thimble and wanted to get a hold of him, but little Thumbling hopped into the cloth, and while the mistress was opening it out and looking for him, he got into a crevice in the table. "Ho, ho, lady mistress," cried he, and thrust his head out, and when she began to strike him, he leapt down into a drawer. At last, however, she caught him and drove him out of the house. The little tailor journeyed on and came to a great forest, and there he fell in with a band of robbers who had a design to steal the king's treasure. When they saw the little tailor, they thought, "A little fellow like that can creep through a keyhole and serve as a picklock to us." "Hi there," cried one of them, "you giant Goliath. Will you go to the treasure chamber with us? You can slip yourself in and throw out the money." Thumbling reflected a while, and at length he said, "Yes," and went with them to the treasure chamber. Then he looked at the doors above and below to see if there was any crack in them. It was not long before he espied one which was broad enough to let him in. He was therefore about to get in at once, but one of the two sentries who stood before the door observed him, and said to the other, "What an ugly little spider's creeping there! I'll kill it." "Let the poor creature alone," said the other. "It has done you no harm." Then Thumbling got safely through the crevasse into the treasure chamber, opened the window beneath which the robbers were standing, and threw out to them one taler after another. When the little tailor was in full swing of his work, he had heard the king coming to inspect his treasure chamber, and crept hastily into a hiding place. The king noticed that several solid talers were missing, but could not conceive who could have stolen them, for locks and bolts were in good condition, and all seemed well guarded. Then he went away again, and said to the sentries, "Be on the watch, someone is after the money." When therefore Thumbling recommenced his labors, they heard the money moving, and the sound of clink, clink, clink. They ran swiftly in to seize the thief, but the little tailor, who heard them coming, was still swifter, and leapt into a corner and covered himself with a tailor, so that nothing could be seen of him, and at the same time he mocked the sentries and cried, "Here am I!" The sentries ran thither, but as they got there, he had already hopped into another corner under another tailor, and was crying, "Ho, ho, here am I!" and thus made fools of them, and drove them so long around the treasure chamber that they were weary and went away. Then by degrees he threw all the tailors out, dispatching the last with all of his might, then hopped nimbly upon it, and flew down with it through the window. The robbers paid him great compliments. "You're a valiant hero," said they. "You will be our captain." Thumbling, however, declined, and said that he wanted to see the world first. They now divided the booty, but the little tailor only asked for a cruiser because he could not carry more. Then he once more buckled on his sword, bade the robbers good-bye, and took to the road. First, he went to work with some masters, but he had no liking for that, and at last he hired himself as a manservant at an inn. The maids, however, could not endure him, for he saw all they did secretly, without their seeing him, and he told their employers what they had taken off of the plates and carried away out of the cellar for themselves. Then said they, "Wait, and we will pay you out," and arranged with each other to play a trick on him. Soon afterwards, when one of the maids was mowing in the garden and saw Thumbling jumping about and creeping up and down the plants, she mowed him up quickly with the grass, tied it all in a great cloth, and secretly threw it to the cows. Now, amongst them there was a great black one, who swallowed him down without hurting him. Down below, however, it did not suit him, for it was quite dark, neither was any candle burning. When the cow was being milked, he cried, "Strip, strap, stroll, when will the pail be full?" But the noise of the milking prevented his being understood. After this, the master of the house came into the stall and said, "That cow shall be killed tomorrow." Then Thumbling was so alarmed that he cried out in a clear voice, "Let me out first, I'm sitting inside of her." The master heard that quite well, but did not know from whence the voice came. "Where are you?" asked he. "In the black one," answered Thumbling, but the master did not understand what he meant, and went out. The next morning the cow was killed. Happily, Thumbling did not meet with one blow at the cutting up and chopping he got amongst the sausage meat. And when the butcher came in and began his work, he cried out with all of his might, "Don't chop too deep, don't chop too deep, I am amongst it." No one heard this because of the noise of the chopping knife. Now poor Thumbling was in trouble, but trouble sharpens the wits, and he sprang out so adroitly between the blows that none of them touched him, and he escaped with a whole skin. But still he could not get away. There was nothing for it but to let himself be thrust into a black pudding with the bits of bacon. His quarters there were rather confined, and besides that, he was hung up on the chimney to be smoked, and there time did hang terribly heavily on his hands. At length, in winter, he was taken down again, as the black pudding had to be set before a guest. When the hostess was cutting it into slices, he took care not to stretch out his head too far, lest a bit of it should be cut off, and last he saw his opportunity, cleared a passage for himself, and jumped out. The little tailor, however, would not stay any longer in a house where he fared so ill, so at once he set out on his journey again, but his liberty did not last long. In the open country he met with a fox who snapped him up without thinking. "Hi there, Mr. Fox," cried the little tailor. "It is I who am sticking in your throat. Set me at liberty again." "You are right," answered the fox. "You are next to nothing from me, but if you will promise me the fowls in your father's yard, I will let you go." "With all of my heart," replied Thumbling. "You shall have all the cocks and hens that I promise you." Then the fox let him go again, and himself carried him home. When the father once more saw his dear son, he willingly gave the fox all the fowls which he had. "For this, I likewise bring you a handsome bit of money," said Thumbling, and gave his father the cruiser which he earned on his travels. "But why did the fox get the poor chickens to eat, you ask? Oh, you silly! Your father would surely love his child far more than the fowls in the yard, right?" Godfather Death, a variation of the earlier story, The Godfather. A poor man had 12 children and was forced to work night and day to give them even bread. When therefore the 13th came into the world, he knew not what to do in his trouble, but ran out into the great highway and resolved to ask the first person whom he met to be a godfather. The first to meet him was the good God, who already knew what filled his heart, and said to him, "Poor man, I pity you. I will hold your child at its christening, and I will take charge of it and make it happy on earth." The man said, "Who are you?" "Well, I am God." "Then I do not desire to have you for a godfather," said the man. "You give to the rich, and leave the poor to hunger." Thus spoke the man, for he did not know how wisely God apportions riches and poverty. He turned therefore away from the Lord, and went farther. Then the devil came to him and said, "What do you seek? If you will take me as a godfather for your child, I will give him gold in plenty, and all the joys of the world as well." The man asked, "Who are you?" "Well, I am the devil." "Oh, then I do not desire to have you for godfather," said the man. "You deceive men and lead them astray." He went onwards, and then came Death, striding up to him with withered legs, and said, "Take me as a godfather." The man asked, "Who are you?" "I am Death, and I make all equal." "Then," said the man, "you are the right one. You take the rich as well as the poor, without distinction. You shall be godfather." Death answered, "I will make your child rich and famous, for he who has me for a friend can lack nothing." The man said, "Next Sunday is the christening. Be there at the right time." Death appeared, as he promised, and stood godfather quite in the usual way. When the boy had grown up, his godfather one day appeared and bade him to go with him. He led him forth into a forest, and showed him a herb which grew there, and said, "Now you shall receive your godfather's present. I make you a celebrated physician. When you are called to a patient, I will always appear to you. If I stand by the head of the sick man, you may say with confidence that you will make him well again, and if you give him of this herb, he will recover. But if I stand by the patient's feet, he is mine, and you must say all remedies are in vain, and that no physician in the world could save him. But beware of using the herb against my will, or it might fare ill with you." It was not long before the youth was the most famous physician in the whole world. He had only to look at the patient, and he knew his condition at once, whether he would recover, or whether he must die. So they said of him, and from far and wide people came to him, sent for him when they had anyone ill, and gave him so much money that he soon became a rich man. Now it so befell that the king became ill, and the physician was summoned, and was to say if recovery were possible. But when he came to the bed, Death was standing by the feet of the sick man, and the herb did not grow which could save him. "If I could but cheat Death for once," thought the physician, "he's sure to take it ill if I do, but as I am his godson, he will shut one eye. I will risk it." He therefore took up the sick man, and laid him the other way, so that now Death was standing by his head. Then he gave the king some of the herbs, and he recovered and grew healthy again. But Death came to the physician, looking very black and angry, threatened him with one finger, and said, "You have betrayed me. This time I will pardon it, as you are my godson. But if you venture it again, it will cost you your neck, for I will take you yourself away with me." Soon afterward, the king's daughter fell into a severe illness. She was his only child, and he wept day and night, so that he began to lose the sight of his eyes, and he caused it to be made known that whosoever rescued her from death should be her husband and inherit the crown. When the physician came to the sick girl's bed, he saw Death by her feet. He ought to have remembered the warning given by his godfather, but he was so infatuated by the great beauty of the king's daughter, and the happiness of becoming her husband, that he flung all thoughts to the wind. He did not see that Death was casting angry glances on him, that he was raising his hand in the air and threatening him with his withered fist. He raised up the sick girl and placed her head where her feet had lain. Then he gave her some of the herb, and instantly her cheeks flushed red, and life stirred afresh within her. When Death saw that for a second time his own property had been misused, he walked up to the physician in long strides, and said, "All is over with you, and now the lot falls on you." And he seized him so firmly with his ice-cold hand that he could not resist, and led him into a cave below the earth. There he saw how thousands and thousands of candles were burning in countless rows, some large, some medium-sized, others small. Every instant some were extinguished, and others again burnt up, so that the flames seemed to leap hither and thither in perpetual change. "See," said Death, "these are the lights of men's lives. The large ones belong to children, the medium-sized ones to married people in their prime, and the little ones belong to old people. But children and young folks likewise have often only a tiny candle." "Show me the light of my life," said the physician, and he thought that it would be still very tall. Death pointed to a little lamp which was just threatening to go out, and said, "Behold, it is there." "Oh, dear godfather," said the horrified physician, "light a new one for me. Do it for the love of me, that I may enjoy my life, be king, and the husband of the king's beautiful daughter." "I cannot," answered Death. One must go out before a new one is lighted.
Then place the old one on a new one that will go burning at once when the old one has come to an end, pleaded the physician.
Death behaved as if he were going to fulfill his wish, and took hold of a tall new candle, but as he desired to revenge himself, he purposely made a mistake in fixing it, and the little piece fell down and was extinguished. Immediately the physician fell to the ground, and now he himself was in the hands of death. Fitcher's Bird. There once was a wizard who used to take the form of a poor man and went to houses and begged and caught pretty girls. No one knew whither he carried them, for they were never seen again. One day he appeared before the door of a man who had 3 pretty daughters. He looked like a poor weak beggar and carried a basket on his back, as if he meant to collect charitable gifts in it. He begged for a little food, and when the eldest daughter came out and was just handing him a piece of bread, he did but touch her, and she was forced to jump into his basket. Thereupon he hurried off with long strides and carried her away into a dark forest to his house, which stood in the midst of it. Everything in the house was magnificent. He gave her whatever she could possibly desire, and said, "My darling, you will certainly be happy with me, for you have everything your heart can wish for." This lasted a few days, and then he said, "I must journey forth and leave you alone for a short time. Here are the keys to the house. You may go everywhere and look at everything except for into one room, which this little key opens, and I there forbid you to go on pain of death." He likewise gave her an egg and said, "Preserve the egg carefully for me, and carry it continually about with you, for a great misfortune should arise from the loss of it." She took the keys and the egg, and promised to obey him in everything. When he was gone, she went all around the house from the bottom to the top, and examined everything. The room shone with silver and gold, and she thought she had never seen such great splendor. At length she came to the forbidden door. She wished to pass it by, but curiosity let her have no rest. She examined the key. It looked just like any other. She put it to the keyhole and turned it a little, and the door sprang open. But what did she see when she went in? A great bloody basin stood in the middle of the room, and therein lay human beings, dead and hewn to pieces, and hard by was a block of wood, and a gleaming axe lay upon it. She was so terribly alarmed that the egg in which she held in her hand fell into the basin. She got it out and wiped the blood off, but in vain. It appeared again in a moment. She washed and scrubbed, but she could not get the blood off. It was not long before the man came back from his journey, and the first things which he asked for were the key and the egg. She gave them to him, but she trembled as she did so, and he saw at once by the red spots that she had been in the bloody chamber. "Since you have gone into the room against my will," said he, "you shall go back into it against your own will. Your life is ended." He threw her down, dragged her along by her hair, cut her head off on the block, and hewed her in pieces so that her blood ran on the ground. Then he threw her into the basin with the rest. "Now I will fetch myself the second," said the wizard, and again he went to the house in the shape of a poor man and begged. Then the second daughter brought him a piece of bread. He caught her like the first, by simply touching her, and carried her away. She did not fare better than her sister. She allowed herself to be led away by her curiosity, opened the door of the bloody chamber, looked in, and had to atone for it with her life on the wizard's return. Then he went and brought the third sister, but she was clever and wily. When he had given her the keys and the egg, and had left her, she first put the egg away with great care, and then she examined the house, and at last went into the forbidden room. Alas, what did she behold? Both of her dear sisters lay there in the basin, cruelly murdered and cut into pieces. But she began to gather their limbs together and put them in order, head, body, arms, and legs. And when nothing further was wanting, the limbs began to move and unite themselves together, and both of the maidens opened up their eyes and were once more alive. Then they rejoiced and kissed and caressed each other. On his arrival, the man at once demanded the key and the egg, and as he could perceive no trace of any blood on it, he said, "You have stood the test. You shall be my bride." He now had no longer any power over her, and was forced to do whatsoever she desired. "Oh, very well," said she. "You shall first take a basketful of gold to my father and mother, and carry it yourself on your back. In the meantime, I will prepare for the wedding." Then she ran to her sisters, whom she had hidden in a little chamber, and said, "The moment has come when I can save you. The wretch shall himself carry you home again, but as soon as you are home, send help to me." She put both of the sisters in a basket and covered them quite over with gold, so that nothing of them was to be seen. Then she called in the wizard and said to him, "Now carry the basket away, but I shall look through my little window and watch to see if you stop on the way to stand or rest." The wizard raised the basket on his back and went away with it, but it weighed him down so heavily that sweat streamed from his face. Then he sat down and wanted to rest a while, but immediately one of the girls in the basket cried, "I'm looking through my little window, and I see that you are resting. Will you go at once?" He thought it was his bride who was talking to him, and he got up on his legs again. Once more he was going to sit down, but instantly she cried, "I'm looking through my little window, and I see that you are resting. Will you please go at once? Go directly." And whenever he stood still, she cried this, and then he was forced to go onwards, until at last, groaning and out of breath, he took the basket with the gold and the two maidens into their parents' house. At home, however, the bride prepared the marriage feast, and sent invitations to the friends of the wizard. Then she took a skull with grinning teeth, put some ornaments on it and a wreath of flowers, carried it upstairs to the garret windows, and let it look out from thence. When all was ready, she got into a barrel of honey, and then cut the feather bed open and rolled herself in it, until she looked like a wondrous bird, and no one could recognize her. Then she went out of the house, and on her way she met some of the wedding guests, who asked, "O Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" "I come from Fitcher's house quite near." "And what may the young bride be doing?" "From cellar to garret she slept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween." At last she met the bridegroom, who was coming slowly back. He, like the others, asked, "O Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" "I come from the Fitcher's house quite near." "And what may the young bride be doing?" "From cellar to garret she swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween." The bridegroom looked up, saw the decked-out skull, thought it was his bride, and nodded to her, greeting her kindly. But when he and his guests had all gone into the house, the brothers and the kinsmen of the bride, who had been sent to rescue her, arrived. They locked all the doors of the house, that no one might escape, set fire to it, and the wizard and all of his crew were set to burn.